Hi there, I'm here to explain to you the astrological wheel. This is part of the archetype training. My reason for explaining the astrological wheel, as most of you would know, is that the archetypes fit in the astrological wheel, but what I'm only concerned about here, and you need to be concerned about, is just the houses. I don't cover the signs and I don't cover the planets. If you do want to go on and explore more about astrology, there's a book by Howard Sasportes, which is Sasportes, and he explains about the houses extremely well. So if you want to explore more, either on the houses, apart from the basic information I'm giving you today, or more about astrology in general, the planets and the signs, then please do so at your own leisure. So for the moment, I'm going around the wheel to explain what each house is about and then how to connect the houses together with the archetypal chart. This will be elaborated on perhaps in the training as well when we get together for the weekend to actually go over all the charts. So your first house is your outer persona, how you project to the outside world and how the outside world sees you. It's not the real you, but it's where you're at and where you're presenting right now. It's the outer you, it's the house of personality. It includes your physical appearance, how you present to the outside world as well. It's the face that you show to the world, and it's very much connected to the ego I, who I am. So for a lot of people, they think I am my job, I am my title, I am the car I drive. All of this can sit in the first house. Let's go around the wheel and move to the second house. Your second house is the house of personal values, self-worth, self-esteem, self-respect. It's, if you like, it's the third chakra if you're into understanding chakras. So the second house also has a major connection known as the house of money, which I'll actually write in here. I've got it in there, but it's a really big thing in terms of the house of money, because if you haven't noticed, money rules this planet. It's God on this planet. And so this includes everything you've picked up about money, your belief systems that you've inherited from your parents, from your culture, from the tribe, that tells you you're not enough if you don't have $5 million in the bank. Or a lot of people inherit belief systems about struggle about money, that it's hard to come by. What we have to understand about money is that it's energy, and it's every bit as available to you as your next breath. But a lot of us don't get that sort of imposed belief system. I have a mother who manages to walk around with her handbag clutched to her chest because she thinks somebody's going to rob her. So that's what I grew up with in terms of the values around money. But on the personal value side, this is all about the inner you. The first house is the outer you, the second house is the inner you. And there are three core beliefs that sit in this second house. Not good enough, what will other people think, and needing approval. Those three core beliefs have a major effect on anything in the second house. If anything is tribal in the second house, pay attention, because it's telling you that there's old core beliefs that are still running the person who you're doing the chart for. Anything tribal, then the archetype will give you the hint what it's around. But especially one of the main four, child, victim, prostitute, saboteur, sitting here at tribal in the second house, is a big red flag. It says pay attention, because one of those three beliefs, not good enough, what will other people think, and needing approval, will be absolutely impacting on them. And that means they can lose their power like that. If someone says something to them, they'll take it totally personally, they'll be wiped by that comment, it will destroy them. Whereas something symbolic here in the second house means you'll have the ability to pick up your energy field and examine it. Is this true? Is this not true? But it won't destroy you. So anything tribal here in the second house, the house of values, is asking you to pay a lot of attention to what's going on here. And as I've already covered, the house of money. Money sits in the 8th house as well, but we'll get to that. So let's move on to the third house. The third house is the house of communication, how you communicate with others, how other people hear you. Your inner critic sits here, monkey mind sits here. Most importantly, For me, it's how you communicate, archetypally speaking, how you communicate with whatever you want to call it, spirit, upstairs, Christ, God, Buddha, your higher self, whatever you want to call it. How you communicate here, again, anything tribal sitting here will be saying to you that you're not communicating. Anything symbolic says your pipeline is well established upstairs to hear it. This is also the house of siblings that sit here as well. So it's, for me, it's an enormous amount about your self-talk here. So anything tribal is giving you an understanding that you could ask the person, do you criticize yourself? Do you tell yourself you're a fool, you're an idiot every time something goes wrong? Because anything tribal here is giving you that indication, that hint that that might be happening here. It's also the relationship to the environment sit here, and neighbours sit here as well. But this is where, when you're doing a chart for someone, you have to see what the archetype is related to the house, and then tie it into, and ask questions, ask relevant questions. So the third house gives you some really good, valuable information about how you're connecting to spirit. On a personal note, I used to talk very quickly and have a lot to say. I have calmed down a bit as you get older. There's a lot to be said for moving into your 60s. But when I studied astrology and realised I had so many planets in the third house, I stopped apologising, because that's just who I am. It's part of the course. So the third house will give you some indication about where the person is coming from. The fourth house, the house of home. This can mean your body is home, the planet is home, your current home, your childhood home. For me, it's got a lot to do with the soul essence, archetypally speaking, with where you're at. Traditionally, this is also known as the house of the mother. So if anything is tribal sitting here in the fourth house, then there is still, like the second house, there is still a lot of unfinished business going on from the childhood. So if there's tribal in the fourth and tribal in the second, your house of values not good enough, what will other people think of you, and then tribal in the fourth, this is telling you there is definitely old unfinished business that's still needing to be fixed up, needing to be dealt with before they can become their highest potential. Then of course the archetype that sits in that house will give you the clue as to what's actually happening. So for me, this is the real you. So the first house is the outer you. It's also the ascendant, where your ascendant sits if you're into astrology. The second house is the inner you, that only your closest friends would know. But the fourth house is the real you. So interestingly, what archetype shows up in the fourth house will have a bearing, of course, on who they are and what they're meant to be and what they're here to aspire to. This, of course, can change as you go through. I'm particularly talking about your natal chart here, your first chart that you ever do. But of course, in my experience over the last 20 years of doing the charts, a lot of this changes, of course, except for the four main archetypes. They always go in every chart, but the other ones can change. But it keeps you updated as to where the person is. This is also the house of real estate that can sit here. As I said, it's about the soul essence of you. It's also about, again, because it's the house of the mother, it's about your emotional foundation, what you received, particularly from your mother, or didn't receive. So again, the archetype will give you a big bearing on what's happening. I'm just going to cross over here to the other side. Save me stretching. So the fifth house is the house of creativity and the house of love. It's the house of Eros, the god of love, though really agape in the Greek sense, if we're talking Eros, is probably more appropriate. This is the house of romance. It's also the house of your children, so biological children as well as inherited children, etc., etc. So it's the house of passion, the house of joy, and the house of self-expression as well. So this is how you give love, receive love, and be love. So for me, there's only one commandment when you're on your deathbed. What have you done with your heart to give love, receive love, and be love? And this house will tell you a lot about that. If anything is tribal sitting here in the fifth house, it is saying that there is way too much mind going on and not enough play, not enough fun, not enough laughter happening here. So, and it doesn't matter what the archetype is. So anything tribal is saying too much left brain, way too much left brain, and because it's the house of creativity, not enough right brain activity. So sometimes the antidote for the fifth house is literally about setting a play date with your friends, and it doesn't matter if it's Pictionary or Tiddlywinks, it doesn't matter, but playing in the fifth house, because for a lot of us, we get caught up in the outside world. We're addicted to busyness. It's one of our major addictions that's running this planet at the moment, and we forget about play because we've been taught it's all about achieving and being successful or whatever that means. So our right brain doesn't get a look in, and we've forgotten how to be children. We're too busy being adults. And we have to be the whole balance. The whole of the chart can be split into 4 equal quadrants, which I'll talk about later. So anything tribal here is really spelling to the fact that there's way too much busy mind going on, and there's no rest. As I say to people, if your mind, left brain, is engaged the whole time, the only way that you leave is that you can give spirit an opportunity to get through to you is through your dreams. There's no other way for it to happen. Or if you don't listen and pay attention to your dreams, then you're sort of inviting in a Mack truck experience where you get wiped somehow or other. Illness, finances, it wouldn't matter. So it's almost a standard rule of thumb that anything tribal here in the fifth house is talking about too much mind and not enough play. But the archetype will give you, like all things, will give you the opportunity to understand that. The sixth house here is the house of work and health. And this is very, very impactful for me, the sixth house. Again, if anything's tribal. I do say to people when I'm starting off with reading their charts, it's awesome if you've got any symbolics there, but I'm actually not really interested in the symbolics. It's the tribals, because the symbolics say you've got, in talking levels of consciousness, the symbolics say you've got a handle on this. Well done, you've got, this is in balance in your life. But the tribals say you haven't been paying attention, and it's the tribals that can bring you undone. However, forewarned is forearmed, and there isn't anything you can't change because you are a powerful person, and you just have to know about it. It just has to come to the consciousness for you to understand that. So anything tribal here in the sixth house is scary, because it means you could, because it's the house of work and health, it means you could be totally annihilated health-wise. And again, depending, for example, caretaker at the tribal here. Caretaker as an archetype seems innocuous, that it's not a big thing like the prostitute would be or whatever. Servant, but it is totally damaging, the caretaker archetype at the tribal level, because what it literally means is you're only valid if you're taking care of others. You have no idea how to take care of the self. You have no idea how to self-nurture or what the word self-love even looks like. You're only valid if you're serving other people. So anyone that has caretaker here at the tribal level is or has the potential, for example, to bring in something really, really major, like breast cancer, because it means you're giving out all the time, and you have the fourth chakra, front heart, and the back heart is all about how you receive love. And for the caretaker at the tribal level, no idea about receiving love or self-nurturing. And sometimes the only way you leave the universe to impact on you is to wipe you out on some level. Behind every breast cancer person I've worked with is the inability for self-nurturing and self-love. It's a given, and I've been doing this for a long, long time in watching that. So the sixth house is also about unequal relationships. So if that's tribal, it would be worthwhile asking the person, are they in relationship? Where's the power base in the relationship? Is it equal, or is it too much in terms of one person has more power than what the other does? It's the least free of all of the houses in the astrological wheel. So if something's tribal there, that's really why you have to start paying attention to it. It's all about acts of service, and this is where you need to do a lot of self-examination in the sixth house as well. I can remember when Jamison Sanctuary was being built, and what was a joy and passion in doing the charts became a chore, because I was doing so many charts because we'd been wiped out financially. and I was working in Melbourne, and my ex-husband was building the property. And I was just working 16-hour days for a long, long time to get the money together. And then I had a very clear dream that showed me I was about to, the potential was to die from leukemia. Leukemia is blood, and it's about lack of joy. So one of the ways to work with the charts for yourself or for others is to pull a chart on the dream you've just had. You can refer the charts to anything that's happening in your life. And I was in no doubt that it was telling me the truth, because I had tribals all the way along the bottom half of the chart. The bottom half of the chart plays out your physical world, and the top half of the chart plays out your spiritual world. So I paid big attention to what's going on in the 6th house in terms of anything tribal there. But anything tribal, I would say in the bottom half of the chart, the 2nd house, the 4th house and the 6th house are all danger signs that say something's going on here, that the person isn't paying attention to them, and there's unfinished business that has to happen. So now we'll move to the upper deck, more the spiritual level, and then I'll pull quadrants together after that. Your 7th house is the old house of marriage, which is now replaced with the house of partnerships. This is your significant one-on-one relationship to people in your life. So it means friends, colleagues, family, workmates, peer group, intimate partner. But the most significant one-on-one relationship is to yourself, and through yourself to whatever you want to call it, your higher self, your guardian angel, white light, God, Buddha, Christ, whomever, whatever you want to call it. But it is that part for you that I will be referring to as your higher self or spirit, as that part of you that has all knowledge, all wisdom, all love, all compassion, and is so beyond religion and any denomination, that it's just the purity of who you really are. So the 7th house is very important for me, also about your one-on-one relationship to yourself, and through yourself to your higher self, as well as in the earth plane to those that are important around you. So it's the house of sharing, and it's a house of mutuality, but interestingly it's also the house of domination as well. So as the 6th house is the least free house, and it's also about unequal relationships, the 7th house can also bring that up as well. Again, if something was tribal there, especially because this is the house of one-on-one relationships, it would be worthwhile asking the question, depending on the archetype, if you had slave there, for example, what would your relationship be like at home, or it could be with your boss at work, or your parents, it could be anywhere, about who calls the shots, what's still going on, and there are questions that you need to ask about this. This is also the house of codependency, which for a lot of people, we're in codependent relationships and we don't even realise we are. It's very subtle, particularly something at the tribal level. So it's the old house of marriage, which used to only get 2, talking chakras again, the first 3 chakras, but partnerships is meant to be a 7 chakra deal. So that's why it's been replaced, a bit more updated. So if there's something tribal in the 7th house, it means that more than anything, what's going on is that you cannot trust in the 7th house, if there's something tribal, your own intuition, your own heart, and then particularly tying it in with the 5th house, if it's tribal, which means there's way too much mind going on, and then something tribal here, the person has a real challenge to start trusting their intuition, their inner knowing, their gut instinct. They can't. They're left brain, rational, logical, scientific. And so that tells you what needs to be done, that they're out of balance because it's only all the mind, and the heart doesn't get a look in, and certainly creativity doesn't as well. So it also says that taking it to the highest possible level, their capacity to trust spirit is not in place either. It can be interesting to say, were you brought up with any religious values, and what does that mean to you? Because it is the house of significant one-on-one relationships. So again, putting a nice slant on it, if anything symbolic here, it means that your capacity to listen to higher guidance is in place, and you can totally have the wonderful, be in the wonderful place of being able to hear the higher guidance, and particularly if the third house of communication is symbolic as well, that's awesome, because that means your capacity to trust yourself, listen to the higher information that's coming through, be it through your dreams or through meditation or just through aha moments, is in place. Whether they do or not is another thing, and I'll just quickly go into that. So for example, if this was symbolic, but the first house, which is what's opposite it, is tribal, then that's telling you when there's a tribal opposite symbolic, and for a lot of people, it's interesting to see how many tribals opposite symbolics they have in what's called the polarities, which I'll touch on in a minute. It means that their heart is able to do all this, able to guide them, to lead them, to show them the way, but the mind gets in the way, and there's often a major push-pull between the heart and the mind, who will I listen to? And then what comes in is doubting mind. Will I, won't I, can I, can't I, should I, shouldn't I? So it's interesting to watch the flow of symbolics opposite tribals in the polarity section. The 8th house is the house of transformation. No bigger transformation than sex. No bigger transformation than death. Sex can be very transformative, and it's how shared resources and finances come in. It's also got a lot to do with passion, as does the 5th house is more to do with love, but this has a lot to do with lust, passion, etc. So the 8th house is, for me, it's also got a lot to do with your life's lesson here. So it's because it's what you've come here to transform. So that can be relevant to every single chart. So if something is tribal there, it means that that's still work in progress, that there's stuff that has to be done. And again, it depends on what the archetype is, will show you what's to be done. So if the child was sitting there in the 8th house at tribal, there's still a fair amount of growing up that has to happen. There's still a lot of childish belief systems or emotions that are in place that have to be worked with. Whereas, of course, if the child's symbolic, that's fantastic. You're going to be able to do what you've come here to do, to finish all of that. So the 9th house is the house of spirituality and wisdom. Religion and philosophy sits here, so does higher education. For me, archetypally, it's got an enormous amount to do about your capacity to talk to spirit and communicate with spirit, particularly, again, in this polarity, because the 3rd house is opposite the 9th. So if they were both tribal opposite tribal, tribal in the 3rd house, whatever archetype, and tribal in the 9th house, then your capacity to listen and let spirit in and your higher guidance come in isn't happening. It's not there. And again, it's a fair bet that the person will be all left brain and not right brain. Maybe they've been, well, we won't go into that. We'll wait and see what the charts present on the weekend. So the 9th house is to do with your morals and your ethics as well. It is the house of publishing, but that doesn't necessarily come into a lot of the charts for me. It's also known as the house of long journeys. That's why it's also the house of travel. But again, archetypally, it's got an enormous amount to do with your capacity, if we're taking it archetypally, to allow spirit coming in. The whole thing for the archetypal charts, you can read the charts and just leave it at totally the physical level. Just take everything at that lowest possible level and just relate it to the physical itself. But for the majority of people that I see in particular, their interest is also into the spiritual. They certainly understand they're a spiritual being having a human experience and not the other way around. So tribal in the 9th and tribal in the 3rd house would say that they're not letting spirit in. Maybe they're addicted to busyness and there's not enough time in the day, or they're too exhausted to stop and meditate or stop and be still or stop and smell the roses, whatever it means. Because of course that has to be put in there in your life in a major way when you understand you're a spiritual being and having a human experience and not the other way around. So I'm just going to cross back to the other side of the board. So the 10th house is the house of highest potential. This is your career and your destiny, what you've come here to fulfill, if you like. Again, the archetype that sits there will be very interesting. It's the house of ambition, as I said, your highest potential. It's also the house of public image. I mean, the first house is to do with the ego eye and the outer image, but this can be how you present to the world publicly. It'd be interesting if you were doing politicians' charts to see what was in the 10th house. It's the house of trepidation in some way, authority figures, and traditionally also known as the house of the father. So the 10th house is the house of the father, and the 4th house, the polarity opposite it, is the house of the mother. If they're both tribal opposite tribal, for example, rest assured there's big unfinished business from the childhood happening there between the mother and father, and the core beliefs that they inherited from their parents, which of course spiritually speaking is perfect for their growth. But there is core unfinished business that's still happening between, inherited from the mother and father, if they're both tribal opposite tribal. The 11th house is the bigger picture, your relationship to the world, hopes, dreams and wishes. And more than anything, this house to me depicts the future of where you're going. So it's the house of friendships, it's the house of global awareness. So anything tribal here is saying that there's still fear and doubt operating. But again, the archetype will call the shots, what it is that's sitting there. Whereas anything symbolic in the 11th house is fantastic, because it's almost like no matter what the rest of the chart is saying, if that's symbolic, then the odds are stacked in your favour that you're going to be able to complete what the rest of the chart is saying. The 12th house is the house of the collective, the hidden, the house of, well, for me it's got a lot to do with the house of karma. So I often say to people, again, where you're brought up with any religion, particularly if you're brought up Catholic, they're taught there is no such thing as any other lifetimes, there's only this one. For me, I easily see other people's lifetimes, so, and I had no religious upbringing, and didn't realise that was a gift actually. So I don't have anything to undo. So sometimes talking about the house of karma for some people is a big stretch because they can't take it. So I just let it go, it doesn't matter. But it's the house of closure. It's also the house of transcendence, and also your hidden strengths sit here as well. So for example, if somebody was to pull one of the main four like victim in the 12th house at tribal, that would be telling you, and you have to take this, for me, the whole thing has to be taken into context. It's hard to just isolate. But if this was victim at tribal, this would be telling you that time and time again, the person had come here to complete this lesson, but they couldn't, because victim at tribal says it's too hard. You've got to fix it for me. You're to blame. They take zero responsibility for what's going on in their lives. And that will tell you, that archetype alone, depending on what's there, but victim at tribal, that they haven't been able to do it in other lifetimes because they've given up. It's too hard, and they have to find their core strength to complete it this time around. Whereas something symbolic there is wonderful, because it's telling you that you do have every opportunity to finish it this time around. All the cards are stacked in your favour, pardon the pun, and that you're able to complete. The opportunity is there for you to complete this time around. So let's start talking about polarities now. So a polarity is very important. It's an opposition. What is opposite? So example, the first house polarity is coupled with the 7th. So this is the first polarity or opposition we come to. Again, as I mentioned earlier, any of the archetypes that have a symbolic opposite tribal, the outcome is maybe. Maybe they'll be able to do it, maybe they won't. Keep in mind when you're reading charts for people that you're usually talking to the adult. So the adult then, who's sitting opposite you, is totally open to hearing this, or they wouldn't be having a chart done. And when you're coming across the tribals on the chart, it's the child within them that struggles with letting go. For all of us with our inner child, it just wants what is familiar, and it just wants to stay safe. So it doesn't want to hear about total expansion and total opportunity and stepping into unknown fields. That scares the living daylights out of your inner child. But the adult sitting opposite you is okay with that, but the child isn't. And so as a symbolic opposite, a tribal, will say maybe they can do it, maybe they won't. It depends who they're listening to at the inner level. Is it the mind they're listening to or the heart? The heart will always be encouraging you to go to your highest possible potential, but the mind won't. The mind connects to the ego, and the ego's food is fear. So it doesn't want you to take those steps, and your inner child will be relating to that. So tribal opposite symbolics can be very significant because it's crunch time for the person. What choices are they going to make? They're at the crossroads. So the first house opposite the seventh will tell you where you're at right now, and the seventh house will tell you where their relationship is to their higher self, whether they're going to hear it or not hear it. Again, the archetype is very relevant. The second house opposite the eighth house, both of these houses have a lot to do with money, because this is your original belief systems around money that you've inherited from your parents, your culture, your peer group, whomever. But so for when I say peer group, that's very important. So if you were brought up in a poverty cycle of consciousness, then it's going to take a massive effort from you to shift to one of abundance if you were brought up with that poverty mentality. Well, that depends what your journey is. So the second house is your original core values around money, whereas the eighth house is more about the bigger picture around money, shared resources and inheritances. But if these are two tribal opposite tribal, tricky, because there's work to be done here. And it may be around money, depends what the archetype is saying. So for example, Midas, which is the archetype of money and the archetype of abundance, if this was sitting in the second or eighth house, it's a pretty fair bet that it is about money, but don't assume. You actually have to ask the question. So I often say to the person, if something's tribal here, these are the core beliefs that sit here, but it's also the house of money. Can you relate to which one is holding you up more? Which one is your stumbling block? Sometimes they'll say all of it, all of the belief systems and all of the money, which just says you've got more to work on. So if there's tribal opposite tribal in the eighth and the second house, it may be about money, but the eighth house is about the house of transformation. It may not be. You can't assume. You'll have to ask questions in that way. The third and the ninth house polarity, as I've already touched on, is about your ability to communicate, to shut down monkey mind, to go to your higher self and allow your higher self to communicate with you, and how much you're prepared to let spirit through to talk to you and guide you. It's a clear indication that, but again, the archetypes, as always, will indicate what's going on. As I've touched on with the fourth and the 10th house, it's the house of the mother and the house of the father. It's the house of home, opposite the house of your highest potential. So again, the archetypes will give you the opportunity to see what's going on. As I mentioned, if there's tribal opposite tribal in the 4th and 10th house, stuff needs to be worked through, because it's still sitting there calling the shots, and the child is still believing it all, the inner child of your client. The 5th and the 11th houses, the 5th house, if that's tribal, as I've touched on, says there's too much mind going on. And the 11th house, if there's tribal there, for example, there's real changes that need to be brought into that person's life, literally. And sometimes I wish I had a prescription pad that I could write to people and say, I'm just giving you the next 6 months off, freezing time and space for you, and your only task is to go out and play and have fun. Because often for people that are tribal in the 5th house, they're so addicted to busyness and achieving and what they believe is success. But it's going to mean nothing on your deathbed. You're not going to be asked how many houses you've got, how much money you've got in the bank, what sort of car you drove. None of that matters. And yet, because we're tribally oriented, we're taught that that's what's important to the tribe. And it is to the tribe, but if you understand you're a spiritual being having a human experience, it won't matter one iota. So, as I've touched on before, the 11th house can give you a good indication about where you're going. 6th and the 12th house combination, as I've said before, anything tribal in the 6th house is a big red flag that says please pay attention, because you could bring yourself undone, uncomfortably undone. And there's a lot of us that have a belief system that you learn through trauma, you learn through hardship, and you learn through pain and suffering, because that's been around for thousands of years. And particularly the old map of the world of the feminine says you learn through sacrifice and martyrdom. That is so out the window these days, because self-love, thank God, is starting to replace that. So for a lot of us, we do learn our lessons the hard way through health, and I have to put my hand up big time for saying that's the way I've learned in the past. Thankfully, I seem to have turned that around and I don't do it much anymore these days. But tribal opposite tribal in the 6th and the 12th house will tell you, anything tribal sitting in the 12th, that this is an incredibly old pattern and it's time to shift it. But tribal in the 6th opposite each other was saying, it's time to be very conscious about this and make the changes that are necessary. So this is a brief overview of the houses. Obviously, we'll elaborate a lot more when we actually go and attend the weekend where we do chart after chart after chart. There is method in my madness in terms of the weekend that we're studying, because you will be doing charts and I will be putting your chart on the whiteboard and the rest of the class will get to see what's going on for you. However, method in my madness says at the end of the day, let alone the end of the weekend, you will see very clearly in no uncertain terms we're all the same. We're all full of shit, pardon my French, but we are. And we're all only wanting one thing, to feel totally safe, to love, to give love, be love, and receive love. And that's the bottom line for all of us. If you knew what love really was all about, you wouldn't come here to the earth plane, you would have bypassed it. It's a hard place to be in a lot of ways, where it's the mental realm and it's a hard place to find the heart. So we will cover this a lot more in the weekend, and your charts will go up, at least 2 or 3 charts for every single person, and then you'll begin to see we're all the same, absolutely all the same. So good luck with this, with the studying of this. It's here for you to tune into, tap into whenever you want, and we'll go as we do the charts themselves. You'll understand how it applies. See you soon.